At the family dinner, my son announced, "Mom, we're selling your apartment to pay off our mortgage. You'll live in the countryside." I silently finished my dinner and left. The next morning, I called the bank, and when my son received the notification, a real nightmare began. Hello, my dear listeners. Thank you for tuning into my channel. I'm always so curious to know where you're from. Please write your city or country in the comments. Feels like we're getting to know each other a little better. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the continuation of this story. And now get comfortable. Enjoy the story. My day, like the last 30 years, doesn't start with coffee or the morning news. It starts with other people's lives. The lives of my son, Arthur, and his family. Today was no different. The sun had barely risen, and I was already standing in my kitchen, the air thick with the savory aroma of braised cabbage and mushrooms. My hands moved on their own, deftly transferring the still hot dish into plastic containers. 1, 2, 3. Click, click, click. The lid snapped shut with a dry, businesslike sound. In one container, the meatballs that Arthur, my 52-year-old boy, still loves. In another, simple, fluffy buckwheat. In the third, this very cabbage. I stacked the containers by the door. In the evening, Arthur will dash in for a minute, grab them, and without even taking off his coat, will say on his way out, "Thanks, Mom. You're a lifesaver." He won't ask about my blood pressure. He won't notice that my limp is a little more pronounced today. He'll just take the food, and his expensive car will whisk him back to his shiny new life, where apparently there's no time or energy for cooking. And I'll remain in my old apartment, in a silence broken only by the creak of the parquet floor and the ticking of the clock in the living room. And for some reason I'll be happy. Happy that he's fed. That I'm needed. Or at least that's what I used to think. Service. That's a word I know well. All my life I have served. First my parents, then my husband, and then, when he was gone, I dedicated myself entirely to my son. I turned down an interesting job at the Academy of Sciences Archives, where they had invited me after my library career. I sold my mother's jewelry so Arthur could have the best wedding, and then his first apartment. I gave without counting, like one breeze, without a second thought. Motherhood is service, isn't it? That's what my mother taught me. But over time, something subtly changed, especially when Amelia entered his life. My daughter-in-law is a dynamic, modern woman with a sharp gaze and a manicure that probably costs as much as my monthly pension. She never said anything bad to my face. No, Amelia was always pointedly polite, but behind that politeness there was something cold, appraising. As if she were looking not at a person but at a resource useful but outdated. My apartment, for example. A 2-bedroom in an old pre-war building with high ceilings and stucco moldings that my grandfather restored. Every object here is a witness. Here is the Carillion birch bookshelf my husband and I bought through great connections. Here is the worn-out armchair where I read fairy tales to Arthur. The air here is saturated with the sense of my life, old books, lemon tea with bergamot, and a faint hint of mothballs from the closet. For me, this is my fortress, my world. For Amelia, it's grandma's junk. A month ago, she carried out her first modernization operation. She arrived with a tape measure and a determined look. "Eleanor," she began in her businesslike tone, "these curtains of yours are just dust collectors. So gloomy, so old. Let's get you some nice white blinds. It'll brighten the place up immediately. My curtains are heavy velvet, the color of ripe cherries. My mother sewed them. They have seen so much. The sun flooding the room on my birthday, the moonlight filtering through on sleepless nights when Arthur was sick. They were a part of the home, a part of me." I tried to object gently as always. "Amelia dear, I'm quite comfortable with them. I'm used to them." She looked at me with that special expression of condescending sympathy that doctors have when speaking to a terminal patient. "Oh, Eleanor, one must keep up with the times. Arthur also thinks it would be better. More hygienic." Arthur's name was the final argument. My son thinks it's better. Therefore I must yield. I always yielded. A week later, a workman came and took down my cherry velvet banners, and in their place, he hung cold, soulless plastic slats. Did it get brighter? Yes, but it was a harsh clinical light. It mercilessly highlighted every crack in the wall, every scratch on the old parquet floor. My cozy, lived-in world suddenly looked neglected and pathetic, as if its skin had been peeled off. I sat in my armchair and felt a draft blow through my soul. And then the requests for money began. Not direct, no. Amelia is a master of insinuation. A text message would arrive. Eleanor, hello? Anna's boots have completely fallen apart, and winter is just around the corner. The prices these days are just astronomical. Anna, my granddaughter, my quiet joy, a 19-year-old history student, the only one in their family who looks at me like a person, not a function. And I, sighing, would open the banking app on my old smartphone and transfer $100, sometimes $200 for my granddaughter's boots. Though I knew perfectly well that boots was a code word. It could mean anything from paying off another credit card bill to one of Amelia's trips to the salon. I transferred the money because I was afraid. Afraid that if I refused, they would stop letting Anna visit me. Afraid of becoming completely unnecessary. And then last Sunday the phone rang. Arthur. His voice was cheerful but somehow artificial. Mom, hi. How are you? Listen, we're expecting you for dinner tonight. Amelia is roasting a duck. Come over, we'll have a nice family evening. My heart skipped a beat. They didn't invite me over just because. It usually meant they needed something more than my meatballs and a couple of $100 for boots. But I pushed the bad thoughts away. Of course, son, I'll be there. Their apartment is the complete opposite of mine. Glass tables, white leather sofas, a huge television covering an entire wall. Everything screams wealth and success. But the home is cold. There's no smell of baking, no stacks of books on the windowsills. It's not a home, it's a showroom. Dinner was tense. Arthur barely looked at me, picking at the duck, which, by the way, was clearly not cooked by Amelia. It had the signature of an expensive catering service. Amelia, on the other hand, smiled too widely and kept refilling my glass with cranberry juice. Anna sat next to me, huddled, and her anxiety was contagious. She kept darting frightened glances at her parents. When the duck was finished and pastries from a fancy bakery appeared on the table, Amelia dabbed her lips with a napkin and said with a thin smile, Eleanor, Arthur has something to discuss with you. I froze. All the air seemed to leave the room. I looked at my son. He finally raised his eyes to me, and in them was a sort of cornered determination. He took a deep breath like one does before plunging into cold water. Mom, he said, looking at the wall somewhere behind my shoulder. We've been thinking and we've decided. We're selling your apartment to pay off our mortgage. The world didn't collapse. It just stopped. The ticking of the clock on the wall, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant noise of cars outside. All sounds vanished. Only his voice remained, flat and alien. Don't worry, he continued, still not meeting my gaze. We won't abandon you. You'll live at the dacha in the countryside. The air is fresh there, it's quiet. At that moment, Amelia, who had been sitting with the air of a benevolent hostess, took out her phone. Without looking up from the screen, she lazily swiped her finger and added, as if discussing the weather, and the dacha has a wonderful apple orchard, Eleanor. It will give you something to do. An apple orchard. Something to do. I moved my gaze from my son's face, which showed nothing but cowardly stubbornness, to my daughter-in-law's triumphant smirk, then to Anna's face. In her huge, horrified eyes, tears were welling up. She looked at me, and in her gaze was so much pain and shame for her parents that for a second, I felt more sorry for her than for myself. And inside me it was quiet. The very quiet my son had spoken of. Only it hadn't arrived in the countryside, but right here at this dinner table in my heart. The hands that had been trembling slightly in my lap suddenly became perfectly still, as if filled with lead. I didn't say a word. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. Slowly, with utmost care, I placed the small pastry fork on the plate. I took my cup of cold tea and took one last small sip. I folded my napkin in half and placed it next to the plate. Then I stood up. They stared at me in stunned silence. Arthur opened his mouth to say something but found no words. Amelia raised an eyebrow in surprise. Without looking at them, I turned and walked towards the exit. My coat was hanging on a rack in the hallway. I walked past it. I left their apartment in just my dress and my old shoes and closed the door behind me. In the absolute silence of my mind, in the void that had formed where love and resentment used to be, there was a distinct dry sound. Click. A key had turned in a lock inside me forever. The street met me with a raw November chill that immediately clung to the thin fabric of my dress. I walked without feeling it. The streetlights floated by as blurry yellow spots. The headlights of passing cars cut through the darkness. But I saw nothing but a smooth, glassy surface inside me. My consciousness had turned into a sea of glass. All the hurts, all the small humiliations, all the years of unquestioning service, the replaced curtains, the solicited money, the thankless dinners, no longer swirled in a vortex in my head. They had sunk to the bottom like heavy silt, leaving only a transparent, icy layer of water above. And in that ringing transparency, I saw a single terrifyingly simple truth. I was not a mother or a grandmother to them. I was a resource, convenient, reliable, and now also liquid. Somewhere in the depths of this new, cold silence, a memory surfaced. My mother's last day. She lay in a hospital bed, small and withered. Her hand in mine was as light as an autumn leaf. She barely spoke, but just before the end, she looked at me with her faded but still clear eyes and whispered, "Zena, whatever happens, keep your dignity. It's the only thing no one can take from you. Keep your dignity." How had I forgotten those words? How had I allowed it to be trampled, exchanged for a bowl of soup for my grown son and the false smile of my daughter-in-law? The cold air I was breathing didn't seem to burn my lungs. On the contrary, it brought me to my senses, cleared my thoughts. Dignity. That's what they were trying to take from me, along with my apartment, along with the memory of my parents, with my books, with my life. I realized that the emotional debt my son owed me was unpayable. It couldn't be measured, couldn't be demanded back. I buried that part of my soul right there, on that deserted street, under the light of indifferent lanterns. The grief for the son I, as it turned out, never had was sharp but brief like a pinprick. By the time I inserted the key into my own door, it was all over. I entered my apartment a different woman. The next morning I woke up long before dawn. In St. Petersburg at this time of year, a thick inky darkness still reigns. But I didn't turn on the light. By touch, knowing every creak of the parquet, I went to the kitchen, then to the small pantry, cluttered with jars of pickles and all sorts of things. On the second shelf in a neat stack they stood. Plastic containers, dozens of them of all sizes, which I had filled with food for Arthur's family for years. I took them down from the shelf, one by one, unhurriedly. I felt no anger, no desire to break anything, only a cold, methodical resolve. I took the largest trash bag, opened it, and began to place the containers inside. This large one for soup, these smaller ones for the main course, this little one for salad. Each click of the plastic sounded in the morning silence like the report of a metronome, marking the end of an entire era, my era of service. When the last container was in the bag, I tied it tightly and put it outside my door. The shelf in the pantry where they had stood was now gaping and empty. And this emptiness was beautiful. It was the beginning of something new. Only then did I go to my room. I opened the closet and took out something I hadn't worn in years. Not festive, no, just my best. A well-tailored wool dress of a deep navy blue, which I had bought back in the Soviet era at Gostiny Dvor, and it still fit perfectly. I put it on, then went to the dresser, took out a modest string of pearls from a jewelry box, a gift from my husband for our 20th wedding anniversary. The pearls were cool and heavy. This was my armor, my uniform for a new life. The bank opened at 9 a.m. I was at its doors at 5 to 9. The young manager, who always greeted me politely, glanced at me and it seemed didn't recognize me at first. Usually, I came here in my old coat and a headscarf, a quiet pensioner, a harmless old woman. Today before him stood an upright, sternly dressed elderly lady. I didn't wait in the general queue. I walked straight to his desk. "Good morning," I said, and my voice sounded so even and firm that I surprised myself. I need a few minutes of your time. Slightly taken aback by my assertiveness, he invited me to sit. Eleanor, of course. How can I help you? I sat down, placed my handbag on my lap, and looked him straight in the eye. I have a long-term deposit in your bank. I wish to close it. He blinked. Close it? But Eleanor, you'll lose the interest for the last period. Perhaps it would be better. I wish to close it, I repeated, not raising my voice but not allowing him to continue. And I wish to remove my son, Arthur Vance, from the list of authorized persons and beneficiaries. While he, flustered and muttering about procedures, searched for my account on his computer, another scene flashed before my eyes. 30 years ago. Arthur was 22. He had just married Amelia. They were living in a tiny rented room. And Arthur was dreaming of a car, a cherry-red Ford Escort. He came to me, already a widow then, and complained that all his friends had cars, while he was like a poor student, that Amelia was nagging him, that he couldn't provide for his family. And I had money in my savings account, a lot of money for those times, left from the sale of my parents' dacha in the suburbs. My inheritance, my safety net. I looked at my dejected, unhappy boy and my heart broke. That same day I went to the bank, withdrew almost half the amount and gave it to him. I remember his eyes, his shout. "Mom, you're the best." I remember how he spun me around the room. I felt like the happiest mother in the world. I had given him my future so that he could have a decent present. And the remnants of that money, multiplied over the years, were now in this deposit. The deposit he already considered his. Here it is. The manager's voice brought me back to the present. Are you confirming? We are closing deposit number. Beneficiary, Arthur Vance. I confirm, I said clearly. Remove him and transfer the entire amount to a new savings account in my name. Access is to be mine alone. No powers of attorney. No beneficiaries. He silently handed me the papers. My hand did not tremble as I signed my name. The signature was firm and confident. I felt no revenge, no schadenfreude, only relief. As if I had finally paid off some old, unbearable debt and become free. Returning home, I sat in my armchair for a long time, looking out the window at the place of the old curtains, at the bare, cold blinds. And for the first time in many weeks, they did not evoke sadness in me. They were just white plastic strips, alien. And soon they would be gone. Later in the evening, I found Anna's number in my address book. I dialed. My granddaughter answered almost immediately. Her voice was anxious. "Grandma, how are you?" I was so worried. I didn't explain anything. It wasn't the time. "Anna, hello dear. I'm fine." I tried to make my voice sound light and calm. "Would you like to take a walk with me tomorrow in the public garden?" There was a silence on the other end of the line. Then I heard her exhale. With such relief, as if she hadn't been breathing since that dinner. "Yes," she exclaimed, and her voice rang with such sincere, bright joy. "Of course I want to, Grandma. I really want to." She didn't know what I had done, but she had heard the most important thing. My voice no longer had that cracked note of the eternal victim. It had steel in it. And she, my smart, sensitive girl, had felt it. And her heart, I knew, soared with hope and relief just like mine. Our walk with Anna in the public garden was like a breath of fresh air after long years spent in a stuffy, locked room. We didn't talk about that terrible dinner, we didn't talk about money or the apartment. We talked about things I thought I had long forgotten. About the smell of damp leaves underfoot. About the stern beauty of the cast-iron fence. About how the clouds over the Charles River looked like paintings by an old master. Anna enthusiastically told me about her professors in the history department, about the debates surrounding the city's founding fathers, about how she had found an old map of our neighborhood in the archives. I looked at her inspired, lively face and understood. This is real family. Not the one that demands, but the one that shares. Not the one that assesses your usefulness, but the one that values your soul. We went back to my place and had tea with simple cookies. And for the first time in many years, my home didn't feel lonely. It felt full. In the evening, after Anna had left, I sat in my old armchair, took a volume of Chekhov from the shelf, and immersed myself in reading. A blessed silence filled the apartment. I didn't know, of course, that at that very moment in an expensive office in the city center, my son Arthur was sitting in an important meeting. I imagine it like this. He was probably putting on a smart face, nodding at some diagrams on a screen, and in the pocket of his suit jacket his phone vibrated. Once, twice. He must have grimaced, thinking it was another spam message, but something made him look. On the screen was a dry, official message from the bank. Dear Mr. Vance, we are writing to inform you that you have been removed as a beneficiary from deposit number. I can imagine how he reread that line. Once, twice. How the letters stopped forming words. How an icy trickle ran down his spine. Right there in the warm air-conditioned air of the conference room. He probably muttered an apology, stepped out into the hallway, and his hands, which had just been confidently holding an expensive pen, were now trembling as he tried to open his banking app. And then he saw the void. In place of that impressive six-figure sum that he had long considered his, on which all his and Amelia's plans were built, early mortgage repayment, a new car for her, a vacation in the Maldives, in place of all that was a zero. Not the money but its absence. The panic must have been primal, like that of an animal whose prey has been snatched from under its nose. I can almost hear his choked voice on the phone when he called Amelia. Her responding shriek, full of rage and accusations. For them it wasn't just a financial collapse. It was the collapse of their world, built on someone else's foundation. In the evening, the silence of my apartment was shattered by the doorbell. Not a short, polite ring but a long, insistent, angry one. As if someone was pressing the button with the full weight of their indignation. I knew who it was. I slowly placed a bookmark in my book, set it on the table and went to open the door. I had barely turned the lock when the door flew inward with such force that it hit the wall. On the threshold stood Amelia. Her expensive coat was unbuttoned, her face red and blotchy. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled. "What have you done?" she shrieked, storming into the hallway. "Have you lost your mind?" Behind her, pale and gaunt, came Arthur. He closed the door behind him and tried to put on a look of sorrowful reason, but his darting eyes betrayed his panic. "Mom," he began with a note of rehearsed pain in his voice. "There's been some terrible mistake. They must have tricked you at the bank, confused you. We'll fix everything." I silently walked into the room and sat in my armchair. In my center of the world. They stood before me like two furious vultures. I looked at my son, at his soft, weak face, now contorted into the grimace of an offended child. "There's no mistake, Arthur," I said quietly, but so that every word reached him. My voice did not tremble. It was as calm as the surface of a deep lake on a windless day. I picked up my book from the table, just to have something to do with my hands. "It was my money," I continued, looking over their heads at the portrait of my mother on the wall. "My parents' money. It was never yours to spend." "Yours?" Amelia screeched. "What are you talking about? We are your family. A family, children. Mothers are supposed to help their children. It's your sacred duty." She began to pace the room, gesticulating as if on a stage. Her voice grew higher and more shrill. "We took care of you. We didn't abandon you like some people do. We offered you a wonderful option, the dacha, fresh air, apple trees, so you wouldn't sit here alone in this junk. And you, what did you do in return? You robbed your own son, deprived your family of a future. Is this your gratitude?" I was silent. I let her vent. I looked at her and saw not an offended relative, but a predator whose piece of meat had been taken away. And while she was screaming about duty and gratitude, clear and distinct images floated through my mind. Took care of you. That was when Arthur would run in for 5 minutes once a month to pick up the containers of food I had spent hours preparing. Didn't abandon you. That was when they would call on my birthday in the evening because they were very busy. Offered you a wonderful option. That was when they decided to kick me out of my own home to plug a hole in their budget. She finally ran out of steam, fell silent, breathing heavily and glaring at me with eyes full of hatred. In the ensuing silence, Her breathing seemed indecently loud. Arthur stood behind her like a shadow, unable to utter a word. Then I slowly closed my book, placed it on my lap, and looked directly at Amelia. "You speak of duty, Amelia?" My voice was just as quiet, but now it had steel in it. "All right, let's talk about duty. For 30 years, it was my duty to mend your husband's shirts, to cook you dinners, and to transfer money for your urgent needs. For 30 years, I fulfilled that duty. And now it's your turn. Now it is your duty to pay your own mortgage." I shifted my gaze to my son. "My kitchen is closed, Arthur. And my bank is closed." I saw the meaning of my words slowly sink in. On Amelia's face, the rage was replaced by stunned disbelief, and then by fear. Arthur just stared at me as if I were a stranger, as if he were seeing me for the first time. And perhaps he was. For the first time, he was seeing not Mom, but Eleanor Vance, a person with her own will. Slowly, not without difficulty, but with a straight back, I rose from my armchair and, without another word, walked past them into the hallway and opened the front door. Wide, invitingly. The air from the stairwell felt fresh and clean. It was the clearest, most final gesture of my life. I wasn't kicking them out. I was simply showing them the way out of my world. They left without looking back. I closed the door and turned the key in the lock. Click. The same sound as in my head 2 days ago, but now it was real, tangible. When the door closed behind them, the apartment didn't become quiet. The silence had been there before, but its quality had changed. Before, it was the silence of waiting, the silence of loneliness filled with my thoughts of them. Now it was the silence of peace, thick, enveloping like a warm blanket. I returned to the room, sat in my armchair, and for a long time, I looked at the empty space where they had just stood. I felt no triumph, no anger, only a vast, all-consuming weariness. And relief. As if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders, a weight I had carried for so long that I had grown accustomed to its heaviness and considered it a part of myself. The consequences of their visit and my decision did not come immediately, but seeped into my life gradually, like water through sand. I didn't follow them, didn't look for news. I learned about their new life in snippets from Anna. She told me without malice, rather with a daughter's bitterness and shame. It turned out that their beautiful life in the shiny apartment was held together not only by the mortgage but also by numerous small loans they had taken out, confident in my safety net. First, they sold Arthur's expensive car. Anna said that her father now took the subway to work, grim and silent. Then Amelia had to get a job. Not in an office where she had aimed, but as a consultant in a clothing store, the only place that would take her without experience and with her demands. My granddaughter told me how my daughter-in-law would come home angry, complaining about ungrateful customers and the pain in her feet from a whole day in heels. Their social life, which had consisted of going to expensive restaurants and meeting the right people, crumbled to dust. There was no money to pay for it. I listened to this silently, nodding. I did not rejoice in their troubles. I was indifferent. Their life had become for me a plot from a distant, uninteresting book. A month passed and Easter was approaching. One evening the phone rang. I thought it was Anna, but it was Arthur's voice on the line. He hadn't called me in a long time. His voice was somehow ingratiating, almost casual, as if that terrible evening had never happened, as if there had been no discarded containers and no icy, "My bank is closed." "Mom, hi," he said. "How are you?" "Hello, Arthur. I'm fine." He paused, choosing his words. "Mom, so Easter is coming up. We were thinking maybe you could bake your famous caliche? Amelia is so tired from work, she has no energy at all." And at that moment I realized that they had understood nothing. Absolutely nothing. He wasn't calling me, his mother, to ask for forgiveness. He was calling a free bakery, which, in his opinion, was supposed to reopen on demand. I paused, letting the silence do its work, and then I answered as calmly as if I were commenting on the weather forecast. "I'm sure they sell very good caliche in the bakeries now, Arthur. Unfortunately, I will be busy. My friends and I are going to a concert." There was a stunned silence on the line. He seemed to have expected anything, reproaches, tears, conditions, but not this polite, final refusal. I see, he finally muttered. Goodbye, Arthur, I said and hung up. My attention was indeed focused elsewhere. The air in my apartment had changed. It had become lighter, cleaner, as if all the years of dust from other people's expectations had been cleared away. I decided that my fortress deserved a renovation. Called in workmen. For a whole week, the apartment smelled of fresh wood shavings and varnish. The workers sanded my old scarred parquet floor. When they finished, it shone with its original honey-colored beauty, reflecting the light. And then I went to the best fabric store on Newberry Street. I spent a long time looking through heavy velvet samples and chose a deep royal sapphire blue. 2 weeks later, new curtains hung in my living room. They didn't scream luxury. They whispered dignity. And when I drew them in the evening, the room was plunged into a cozy, protected twilight, in which it was so good to read and think. My life, which had once been compressed to the size of my kitchen and the needs of my family, began to expand. I called my old friend from the library, Valentina, whom I hadn't seen in almost a year. She was so happy. We started meeting every week. We went to the symphony, which I had loved so much in my youth. We sat in small cafes in the Back Bay, discussing not the price of groceries, but a new novel or the acting in the latest play at the Huntington Theater. I suddenly realized how much I had missed this simple, equal human interaction. But my greatest joy was Anna. Our bond deepened into something profound and real. She would come to my place 2 or 3 times a week, and we could sit for hours in my updated kitchen. She listened with such sincere, eager attention, the kind she probably gave her professors at the university. I told her about the books in the bookcase, where they came from, who had read them, what notes her great-grandfather had left in the margins. I told her about every object in this house, about how her grandfather, my husband, had restored this dresser himself, about how her great-grandmother had hidden letters from the front in it. I was passing on to her the history of our family, the real history, not the one made of sacrifices and debts, but the one made of love, loss, and small victories. I was finally reclaiming my past, my family, my identity. And so today, on one of these quiet evenings, I am standing by the window. The sunset has painted the sky over the rooftops of Boston in a soft pink color. I am watering my new geraniums, which have grown lush on the windowsill. Their small scarlet flowers seem especially bright in the rays of the setting sun. The warm light floods the room, plays on the lacquered parquet, warms the velvet of the sapphire curtains. My home breathes with peace. My gaze falls on a photograph on the wall. A young, beautiful woman with clear, kind eyes. My mother. I look at her and smile. And at that very moment, a crystal-clear understanding comes to me. I realize that the real nightmare was not in that bank notification that destroyed my son's plans. The real nightmare was the quiet, imperceptible daily sacrifice of my own soul that I had been making year after year. The nightmare was in the silence when I was humiliated, in the agreement when a piece of me was taken away, in the belief that my value was measured only by my usefulness to others. And now, for the first time in many, many years, I was awake. Thank you for being with me until the very end. If this story touched you, please give it a like and write in the comments if you or your loved ones have ever faced similar disrespect in the family. Your opinion is very important to me. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Be well and please live authentically.